Now, without diminishing the passion and hard work that our athletes have driven our athletes to their sporting success, I would like to share some thoughts about how we reward them. As those in this House are aware, we currently have programs that offer monetary rewards for medals. I previously filed a question to this House asking the Minister for Community, Culture and Youth what the parameters were for determining the cash incentive awards offered under the Major Games Award, or MGA, of the Singapore National Olympic Council, or SNOC, and why a distinction existed between the SNOC's MGA and the Athletes' Achievement Awards, or AAA, of the Singapore National Paralympic Council, or SNPC, when measured at comparable international levels. Questions of this nature are not unique to me, of course. PAP and Workers' Party members of Parliament have previously asked questions about seemingly unequal rewards and recognition accorded to both athletes with and without disabilities. This is clearly a matter of bipartisan concern. In the parliamentary reply by then Minister for MCCY Grace Fu, she explained that the SNOC and SNPC were non-governmental organizations and that the MGA and AAA were decided by sponsors and donors. This response was essentially repeated by Minister Tong's response to previous PQs that had been filed. Now, the SNOC and SNPC are undeniably NGOs. But they are NGOs of this. Are they indeed NGOs of the same standing and milieu as, say, the Association of Women for Action and Research, or AWARE, SIONI, or the Humanitarian Organization for Migration Economics, or HOME? The SNOC was established to receive the official invitation by the IOC to send Singaporean representatives to the Games. The current president of the SNOC is Minister Grace Fu, and past presidents and council members include ministers and MPs. And who are these sponsors and donors? The SNOC states on its website that the primary sponsor of the MGA is the Tote Board family, comprising Singapore Pools and the Singapore Turf Club. The SNPC has similar language describing the primary sponsor of the AAA. The Tote Board is a government agency, and its activities and those of its subsidiary entities are regulated by various ministries. Each year, the subsidiaries contribute hundreds of millions to nation-building efforts and indirectly to the budget through taxes on betting. Hence, what's true that SNOC and SNPC are NGOs and that the sponsors of the MGA and AAA are varied, it is difficult to see why the government has decided that it cannot exercise greater influence over the amounts granted by these two sporting award programs. So, if the government does choose to exercise greater influence over the MGA and AAA, the question that remains is whether the current amounts granted in each are reasonable from an economic and moral perspective. What should the value of such an award be? Some have claimed that we ought to respect the economics of supply and demand. While I do not believe, ironically enough, that economics should be the basis for justifying such awards, allow me to elaborate on why such arguments are somewhat naive. The supply side is straightforward. This is the effort expended by our sportsmen and women that compete in major international games. But as any athlete would tell you, their driving motivation to perform at their best in the sporting arena often has very little to do with monetary gains. Indeed, most do it for their deep love for the game and would almost certainly do it for comparatively little money. And the fact that so many of our athletes do so for generally low levels of remuneration is a living testament to that reality. Many have put their lives on hold to bring glory to the nation. Still, there's no denying that even our leanest and meanest athletes need to eat, drink, and earn a living. At the margin, rewards for performance at the highest levels do make a difference in ensuring that our sportsmen and women are able to continue the pursuit of their passion, not least by allowing them to persist in the rigors of their training and climbing the ladder of competition during the lean years, where success is neither assured nor yet guaranteed. In contrast, demand derives from us, the audience and supporters and lovers of a sport. Our interests and willingness to pay for the joy and entertainment we receive when we watch sporting events is what allows a sport, any sport, to be viable enough that professionals can emerge. It is along these lines that some have chosen to argue that the comparative lack of demand for the Paralympics means that there's little economic justification to rewarding Paralympians with the same order of monetary compensation as our Olympians when they medal. Here's the problem with such an argument. While such dynamics may be true for any sport as a whole, it seldom translates into actual compensation for individual sportsmen and women. After all, raw market forces have seldom been the sole driver for monetary compensation in sport. If so, the US women's soccer team, which both draws far larger crowds and generates significantly larger revenue, at least within the US, and has, in fact, achieved much greater sporting success than the men's team, would not have filed suit against its own soccer federation for reasons of unequal pay. Nor would the athletes playing in the billion-dollar NCAA leagues continue to receive only limited compensation in the form of tuition waivers, living expenses, and endorsement rights. But let us take such an argument to its logical conclusion. If we were to reward our athletes according to eyeballs, then surely our awards must vary by sport, differing rewards for soccer versus sepak takraw versus silat, in accordance to their popularity. But we do not, and rightly so. We recognize that we wish to support a wide range of sport because we see the value in each and every one of them. Rather, salaries and rewards in sport are determined as much by sponsorship interests, relative bargaining power, and the institutional strictures, much like the payouts for the MGA and the AAAR. So I have sketched out the case for why economics does not offer an unequivocal case for unequal treatment between the MGA and AAA. But it's worth perhaps exploring the moral arguments, which I believe are even more compelling. Hence, another argument sometimes made to justify the differential rewards that our Paralympians compete in finer categories. Subsequently, their field of competition is correspondingly smaller, and hence they deserve less of a reward for rising to the top of that narrowed field. To me, this is again a distinction without a difference. Fields widen and narrow every year for all sorts of reasons. Birth cohorts fall in size in certain Chinese horoscope years and rise in others, but we don't tell those who were born in the year of the dragon that their A division goals somehow deserve more acclaim than those who were born in other years. Similarly, we don't tell our female weightlifters and bodybuilders that, because their sport is less popular among women than it is with men, or that more bodyweight categories exist in one gender versus the other, they should receive a smaller award when they win. Rather, our awards are simply organized by coverage of the competition. If the rules for participation allow for global, continental, or regional, we scope out award sizes accordingly, regardless of how many competitors eventually sign up. This approach is defensible because while it does not prescribe in advance whether any given sport or athlete should be deemed more worthy of a greater reward based on their observable attributes. Instead, it focuses, as it should, on how many potential competitors there might be based on the geographic scope of the competition. This argument also glosses over the fact that what the different categories capture are disabilities. Lest we forget, Paralympians placed in these different categories are competing not on the basis of these classifications, but in spite of them. Hence, I personally find any suggestion that the athlete is somehow, even if indirectly, benefiting from this smaller field morally indefensible. So this speech has been about equal compensation, but life, of course, is about much more than that. I will conclude by explaining why equality in monetary rewards for sport implies something that goes well beyond the pecuniary. Certainly, our country recognizes and celebrates the achievements of our Paralympians in many ways beyond the financial. But in my view, not only are such accolades insufficient, they also strike me as inconsistent. If these non-pecuniary benefits alone were sufficient, then surely no additional MGA or AAA would be necessary. Conversely, if we see the value to a monetary reward of even a single dollar, then it behooves us to explain why we are comfortable with a distinction between our able-bodied versus disabled sports people. To put it in more concrete terms, we should be able to explain why Ms. Yip Pin Siu, our country's most successful sportsperson, has been rewarded comparatively less than others for achievements of a comparable caliber. I believe we should take the economically and ethically justifiable step of equalizing the monetary awards offered to our Olympians and Paralympians in their respective award programs. I believe that this government, as a key stakeholder in the IOC, as the controlling body of the tote board, and as the elected leaders of our people and society, can make the call to do so. We should not defer the decision to other bodies with less standing. Other countries have also taken steps to move toward parity between the two. Canada announced at the start of this year that medals for Paralympians would be equal to those of their Olympian counterparts. The United States has done so since 2018 and even renamed their national governing body into the Olympic and Paralympic Committee. Host nation France increased funding by 2.5 times so that they would be able to reward their medalists equally. We routinely argue in this House about ensuring equal opportunities for every Singaporean. We have repeatedly spoken about fostering a society of compassion and empathy. And we await the passage in this House on the non-discrimination bill, an idea that the Workers' Party has championed for a long time. Minister Tong has spoken of plans to revise and refresh the DSMP. Let us do so with the MGA and the AAA too, recognizing the accomplishments of all our sportsmen and sportswomen equally, with the rewards that they so definitively deserve.
The second point I'd like to respond to would be the incentive awards. Let me explain this with some context so that members can understand. First of all, as Ms. Usha Chandradas pointed out, this is put up by non-government entities. It's decided by them. They decide on the funding, the appropriate level, the structures, the terms on which this is done. Between the Olympic and the Paralympic structure, there are differences. But these differences doesn't mean one is necessarily better than the other. Let me explain. In the Olympics, for example, the first and only goal that is rewarded under the incentive program is the first goal for $1 million. Under the Paralympic program, it's 500,000 for each goal, but it goes up to 3 goals. So it's different, not necessarily comparable in the same way. And these are also decided by the private sector on a range of different considerations. They have to think in terms of whether this is sustainable. Is this an incentive program that drives the right behavior? And how long-term can this be? Bearing in mind, for example, that if you compare Paralympics with Olympics, just in swimming alone, there are 141 Paralympic swimming events for which medals are awarded, as opposed to 37 in the Olympics. So when the private sector, as well as Tote Board looks at this, these are amongst the considerations that they have in mind. Prof. Jamus Lim also spoke about equalizing, and I think several other members as well. With reference to some data, I think there was an article cited by Ms. Chandradas. Prof. Lim spoke about the experience in Canada. Let's not also forget that even as we look at trying to find parity, let's not forget where we start and where we are today in Singapore. Like Ms. Chandradas says, Singapore is amongst the highest, if not the highest, in terms of the incentive scheme amounts in absolute terms. Prof. Lim spoke about Canada, but I think Prof. Lim would know that Canada's goal, Canada's incentive for a Paralympic goal is 20,000. We are at 500,000. And I'm not sure whether Canada looks at the second or third goals as we do. Other countries mentioned in Japan by Ms. Chandradas, their goal is at 20,000. Korea, 50,000. France, 100,000. Australia, 15,000. So let's not also miss the wood for the trees. We have been pushing the amounts up over the years, and I can understand and I appreciate entirely why members have said, let's find parity. Because there is, in fact, no difference between the way in which our para-athletes train, put effort, make sacrifices, as well as our Olympic athletes. But let's not also lose sight of the amounts in absolute terms and how much we support our athletes. I also want to explain why we have taken the position that we have left the incentive schemes to the private sector and to the tote board to handle. These awards, based on each major games, they are set up, and as you know, the games are cyclical. And at each game, like the Olympics, there might be a gold medalist or there might not be a gold medalist. But the amounts that are committed will have to be put aside and have to be provided for, and you can't use them. In contrast, because you can't use them, you can't deploy the funds elsewhere. In contrast, what the government does is we look at a year-on-year long-term master plan, like the DSMP as an example. We cater for infrastructure upgrades, development. We look at facilities. We look at building up the academies like Active SG Academy, the para sport academies, the coaches, the specialist physios that we employ for para athletes, sports science, the programs that I spoke about earlier in my speech, the various bursaries that we put together, like in sports cares bursaries, as I spoke about in my opening speech as well, to support the lower income, and of course the SPECS program, amongst others. These are all spendings that are committed and that every year are spent to improve the infrastructure and landscape for both para and disability sports as well as able-bodied sports. And this is an investment that the government is committed to. It is not if you win an award, not whether, but it is a commitment that we make. If you put aside sums and think about whether or not I need to provide for X number of gold medals each cycle, these are sums that will not be able to be deployed. So we look at it differently. We decide that we want to invest these amounts, spend them, make a commitment, and ensure that we have efficiency for the spend that we make. And it is an assured amount every year, year on year, on a long-term master plan. And more importantly, we also take the approach that when you have an incentive program, it is good. And we applaud the various supporters and corporates who come forward to help us in this effort. It is very good. But it is also rewarding people who are more or less at the end of the journey, winning a gold medal. It doesn't directly go towards helping those in development, which is what we want to do with a broader spend so that we can reach and target broader base mass appeal and developing a pipeline so that more athletes, para as well as able-bodied athletes, can reach the apex of their sport and reach their aspiration. And that's the thinking that we have in government on why we leave the private sector and tote board to deal with the incentives while we make commitments here and now and in the long term on facilities that overall lift the base of sports entirely.
I appreciate that the amounts we offer are indeed comparatively lower compared to the other nations that are comparatively higher relative to the other nations that Minister Tong mentioned. I will only add a few points. First, it is also true that we are both richer and win less medals overall, unfortunately, than these nations. And so, in absolute terms, this should make the burden just somewhat more affordable. I would only, to be clear, I'm not innocent of the very real budgetary constraints that we face in raising and the implications of raising the amounts. I will only ask Mr. Tong if he would at least agree with the principle of equalizing awards. If he does, then it comes down to, I think, the government working in tandem with the tote board as well as other private donors to try to realize their aspiration.
So I would agree with the principle that we equalize our support for all athletes, regardless of whether they are para-athletes or able-bodied athletes, and regardless of whether they take part in major games or otherwise, across the entire spectrum. That has been our approach. That's why our Active SG academies now have para-sports academies as well. And to the extent possible, we have NSAs where the para-sports take part in the sport side by side with the able-bodied athletes. So these are steps that we're taking to bridge the gap, if there's one. But I would not necessarily say that our focus is only on making sure that the incentives are equalized. Because there is a danger in that, which is the point I was making to you earlier, Prof. Lim, that in trying to strive towards equality, you miss the wood for the trees, which is where we are already today. Would you rather have equality, or would you rather want substantive support that's being given to para-athletes? I think the answer is pretty clear.